Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard. Breaking news, we have a trade. With that, welcome into another episode of The Lager Line, brought to you by Clutch City Lager of Carbox Brewing. As always, I'm your host, Ben DuBose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, contributor to Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. For today's show, in which we're going to be talking about the start of training camp, but largely reacting to the 8-player trade announced on Thursday night, or I should say leaked on Thursday night, still as a Friday morning, not officially announced. 8-player trade between the Rockets and Thunder. To react to that and analyze what exactly the Rockets did in this complex transaction, I'm joined again by my friend Paulo Alves. You may know him on Twitter as Paulo Alves NBA, where he produces all sorts of Rockets content and analysis, and now he's the author of the new Nameless Notes newsletter. So, Paulo, I've always respected your analysis, but let's start with the bigger picture. Scale of 1 to 10, how much is the NBA forever changed by this 8-player Rockets Thunder trade?
Oh, it will never be the same. This is one of those trades that it's James Harden to the Brooklyn Nets all over again. This is completely league shattering. It's just that this is what you live for when you're in F5 season. But
8
no.
players.
No, but to be frank, it isn't a league shattering deal, but it does show something that we've seen with Rafael Stone. Or two things we've seen Rafael Stone thus far in his tenure, which is he's really good at just these around the margins deals, which don't seem to be, the biggest of deals, but you gain a little bit of an advantage in the sense of the Rockets were a team that was really lacking in second round picks. They had a lot of firsts, but during the Morey era, they traded a lot of the second round picks away, and a lot of them are tied into the picks they owe to the Thunder, right? And so because of that, the Rockets didn't have a lot of tradable second-round picks, and over the last 2 months, between the Christian Wood trade and the trade down for Ty Washington, they've acquired 3 of them.
They also acquired a second-round pick about a year ago in that deal when they took the salary from Brooklyn. They got a 2024 second in that one as well. So, yeah, they've done a pretty good job of sort of replenishing that stockpile, not just in the first, but the seconds. And the seconds are super useful because it prevents you from bottoming out. If you end up having a mega deal where you trade your first, those are obviously the prime currency around the NBA these days, and you're seeing more of these, 3, 4 future first-round picks, the Rudy Gobert deal template, if you will. You're seeing that becoming more and more popular. It's crazy because a few years ago when Daryl Morey reportedly offered for Jimmy Butler, that was in 2018, people acted like it was crazy. Now it's fairly commonplace. But if you do that, having these especially these seconds that are hopefully high to maybe the middle part of the order, prevents you from having like a total devoid of young talent, right? You at least get something rather than potentially being devoid of assets if something comes along where you have to trade your first.
Yeah, and they're really good now that we rarely see first-round picks just being traded for straight-up role players, right? Usually teams are trying to package them all together to get a star. Mm-hmm. Second-round picks are kind of the lower tier of assets, right? Because you've got to give up something to get something. And if first-round picks individually are this valuable now that Eric Gordon can't fetch a first-round pick outside of this year, or Bojan Bogdanovic couldn't fetch a first-round pick. Second-round picks are now important because they're that middle-tier asset. Because you've got to give something up, and second-round picks a lot of the time are that. And they're also really useful, not for now because Rockets are not in that situation yet, but when they're trying to compete, when they've paid their young stars, right? When they're trying to do maneuvering right up to the tax line, that's when these second-round picks also come into place because the Atlanta Hawks 2 days ago had to spend one or to send to the Thunder for a switch that effectively saved them $3 million and got them back below the tax. Right? A couple of years, not a couple of years back at this point, but a few years back, we saw the Rockets give up first-round picks for deals of the same sort. Not as little money, but you see what I mean. And so, second round picks, while they don't have a lot of value, because the value of first round picks is so inflated, they now have more value as well because
Mhm.
you're not always going to have a fringe young talent that you can throw in a trade, right? And so second round picks are important for that as well.
Yeah, and we should also point out that there's no Stepien rule with second round picks. So whereas a lot of the times teams, even if they're willing to trade their first round pick for an upgrade or perhaps to lower their tax bill, whatever it may be, sometimes they can't because, of course, that rule makes it to where, especially at the deadline, you can't be without a future first round pick in consecutive drafts. And sometimes that can put you in a tough spot. Whereas with second round picks, yeah, if you have a lot of them, you could conceivably, if need be, package 2 or 3 of those together, and it's not subject to that same strict rule. So it just gives you a lot more flexibility in general. And before we go into any more analysis about second round picks and these moves at the margins that Rafael Stone is making, let's start by highlighting the particulars of the 8-player trade. Rockets sending out David Nwaba, Trey Burke, Sterling Brown, Marquise Chris. 3 of those 4, Burke, Brown, and Chris, it was basically a matter of time. Ever since the Rockets acquired those guys in late June as part of the 5-player trade, sending Christian Wood to Dallas. They also got Boban, but they're clearly keeping Boban. Those other 3 were not part of the long-term calculus for the Rockets. It's just they kept them around for this reason, to see if they could make something happen with the contracts, because in the offseason, you can have up to 20 players, so there was no need for them to rush into a release. You want to see if you can combine those salaries and perhaps get an asset or perhaps just a larger salary, which is what ended up happening with Derrick Favors. More on that in a minute. But yeah, these 3, all veterans, they're clearly not in the long-term calculus for the Rockets. They were just included in the Christian Wood trade to fill salaries. It was just a matter of keeping them around to see if you could turn them into an asset. And really the deadline was approaching because that 20-man off-season limit shrinks to 15 standard contracts and 2 two-way deals for the regular season, which starts basically just in 2.5 weeks. So the Rockets and Rafael Stone had to act fairly quickly if they wanted to do something with those contracts, because they were basically going to have to release all or most of those guys in a couple of weeks anyway, as they trim the roster for the regular season. So ultimately they were canvassing the league, and this was the best deal that they could get from the Thunder. As far as who's coming from Oklahoma City to Houston, mentioned Derrick Favors, veteran big man, also Mo Harkless, veteran wing. Both Harkless and Favors known primarily for their defense. Favors 31, Harkless 29 years old. Also Teo Maladone, 21-year-old, 6'4" guard. He was a high second-round pick in 2020, could be intriguing. And Ty Jerome is the 8th and final player in the trade, and the Rockets are reportedly already waiving him. That's going to clear the roster spot for Willie Cauley-Stein, who the Rockets want to sign, veteran big man, so they can have his big man, so they can have his G League rights, and put the big man with the Rio Grande Valley Vipers and see if there's potentially something still there. Cauley-Stein, 28 years old now. It's going to take about 48 hours for Jerome to clear waivers, and then at that point, the Rockets will have the open roster spot, and they can sign Willie Cauley-Stein. So the 3 players actually going and sticking in Houston for the time being: Derrick Favors, Mo Harkless, Teo Maladone, and then the Rockets are also getting a 2025 second-round pick from the Thunder. It's actually via Atlanta. It's protected for picks 31 through 40. If it doesn't convey in 2025, then the Rockets would get the second best of Oklahoma City's 3 second-round picks in 2026, those being their own, and then ones from Philly and Dallas. Ultimately, though, I think that pick in 2025, the odds are that it conveys from Atlanta, because with Trae Young, the Hawks seem to be in a pretty good place, relatively young, and barring just the bottom falling out with catastrophic injuries, I have a hard time seeing the Hawks being one of the 10 worst teams in 2025. And as long as that's not the case, then that second round pick is going to convey from the Hawks in 2025, which is the point of the deal. And some might ask, why are the Thunder including this second-round pick in a trade in which really none of these guys were clear rotation players for either team. I mentioned Brown, Burke, and Chris. Basically, the Rockets had no plans for them at all. David Nwaba, useful defender, but really wasn't a consistent part of the Rockets' rotation a season ago and wasn't going to be moving forward. Should mention all of these guys, all 8 players basically on expiring contracts, so it doesn't impact either team's long-term cap picture. So why would the Thunder include that second-round pick if they're trading for guys that really aren't that good, aren't going to play, and it's not like they're ditching long-term salary? Well, it's because they're ditching more overall salary in this year one. The Rockets are taking on more than $20 million from the Thunder, whereas the Rockets are only sending out about $13.5 million. So by virtue of taking on more salary in the short term, it reduces Oklahoma City's potential luxury tax figure, gives them more wiggle room. Then the Thunder are compensating them with cash considerations. Jackson Gatlin reported about $6 million, and then the future second-round pick from Atlanta. So basically, the Rockets are using their space beneath the tax line to take on some bigger contracts from the Thunder, and Oklahoma City is incentivizing them to do that by including one of their future second-round picks. So it's a pretty savvy move. It's comparable to when the Rockets took on salary from Brooklyn a year ago to get that future second, replenishing the stockpile, as we said. And then the other benefit of this, we mentioned having to consolidate the roster in a couple of weeks, and they would have lost at least 3 of the 4. I don't think they would have cut Nwaba, but definitely the other 3 they would have had to release. And by doing that, the biggest salary they would have in terms of the tier of players in this deal would be David Nwaba at $5 million. Whereas in this deal, Derrick Favors, also an expiring contract, but he makes over $10 million, $10.2 million. So by virtue of getting a bigger contract, the Rockets have a lot more flexibility leading up to the trade deadline when it comes to matching salary. That's where this deal really comes into play. Beyond the second-round draft pick, it helps them a ton from the perspective of matching salary. Basically, you can insert Derrick Favors into the David Nwaba roster slot, so you don't need to create another roster spot. It's basically just inserting Favors for Nwaba, but instead of having $5 million to help match salary in trades this season, you have more than 10. So while I think the future draft pick was sort of the primary incentive in this deal, I would say a close second was the fact that Favors gives them a lot more flexibility in trades as they get closer to the trade deadline. He can't be aggregated in deals until 60 days. So basically consider it December 15th. That's sort of the unofficial kickoff to trade season in the NBA anyway, because that's when most of the guys who signed in the offseason can be dealt. And the point is, by December 15th, Favors will be trade eligible. And I'm not going to say or speculate what the possibilities are because we're so far away from that. But I do think it's worth noting, Chris White on Twitter pointed out that between Favors and Eric Gordon, you now have nearly $30 million in matching salary that's expiring. And with the NBA's rules on matching salary, if you have nearly 30, then that can put you basically within range to trade for players just from those 2 up to $35-36 million. And that's really interesting because we've talked all off season about the Rockets being in a tough spot to match salary. Well, now all of a sudden, I don't know that a huge name is going to come on the market that they want to strike for. But between Gordon and Favors, the possibility is at least there, right? Like, you now have the money that you can theoretically make a bigger swing happen if something, if a situation got crazy and somebody came on the market, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that's really important is, like you said, Derrick Favors making more money than Nwaba, and they were going to waive the other guys anyways. But when you look at this team, especially because of the John Wall buyout, which was massive and has a big toll on this season, besides Derrick Favors and Eric Gordon, all of the guys on this roster, besides Boban, who I don't think they're trying to trade, they are all on really small contracts and they're all young pieces, right? So they're not the type of players you include as salary match. So it's even more important to have a contract like Derrick Favors that makes $10 million if you're exploring a KJ Martin trade, for example, right? And he's making so little money that if the team doesn't have a TPE, they're probably going to have to send the player back. And so in a team that has so little salary filler, it's important to have some via a player that really isn't worth anything to the team. Another small win with this trade is the Rockets were looking for the center in free agency, right? And Derrick Favors is not some catchy name, but if you need a body to throw out there and play center minutes, he is someone who's, an experienced vet. So you have an option there as well if injuries or foul trouble or whatever you want to call it happens. There's a backup there. And the other thing I was going to say is it's interesting that they're dealing with the Thunder again. Because this is very much a Thunder type move for the Rockets, where they're leveraging the fact that they are far from the tax to gain a second round pick. For the last 2-3 years during the Thunder's rebuild, we've seen Presti do this time and time again. We've seen him take bad contracts. We've seen him facilitate the most minuscule deals, like the Fitzcrike for Mo Harkless deal a couple of days ago, right, to gain these small advantages. And now the Rockets are doing the exact same thing to the Thunder. And it's interesting to keep up with. These teams are largely in the same situation. So when this is the case, usually there's not many deals between the two teams trying to rebuild or two teams trying to contend. But the Rockets have found a way to basically every season just have a deal with the Thunder. So I think it's interesting to look at the relationship between the front offices and realize the deal that the Thunder are making could have been done with 10 different other teams, right? Dumping some salary, dumping $7 million of salary, compensating it with $6 million in cash, and throwing in a second round pick is a deal that you could probably have made with a multitude of other teams. But they did it with the Rockets because I think it's safe to say that there's a relationship there, and that and that that's something that's worth considering going forward as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's worth keeping in mind that Rafael Stone and Sam Presti seem to be willing to deal with one another, even when they're in similar stages of their franchise rebuild, which makes sense. Even if there's a bit of a rivalry between the fan bases, especially on social media, the GMs are smart enough to at least see the other as a resource. In this case, yeah, it is noteworthy because clearly they could have found that type of dump deal other places. So the fact that there's a degree of comfort between the front offices, yeah, it's interesting. It's worth filing away that they are willing to sort of help the other out. I mean, obviously the primary incentive is to help their own team out, but the fact that there's that trust there between the front offices, it's noteworthy as we move forward, especially because these two teams could be quasi rivals in terms of their expected timetable, both getting so many young assets and freeing up salary cap flexibility in the coming years. So yeah, as we get through the decade of the 2020s, it's noteworthy that these two teams, even on fairly similar timetables and at fairly early points of the rebuild, although the Rockets a bit more exaggerated with the timetable simply due to their future draft pick obligations to the Thunder, of course. So we know the Rockets a year from now are going to be trying to win. But yeah, it is interesting. The front offices, after all these years, still willing to work together. And perhaps it just comes down to the fact that they have had so many dealings over the years, even though Rafael Stone wasn't the GM when the Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook trade went down or the original James Harden trade. He was in the Houston front office. And so I'm sure that built and bolstered the relationship that the Rockets had with Sam Presti and his staff at OKC. As far as the basketball side of this, I think primarily, again, the incentive is the future second round pick, Rockets taking on salary to get a pick asset. And then we talked about Favors as matching salary. There is some value to Favors as a big man. I'm not sure if he's going to play simply because if it's close, I think the Rockets would err on the side of either Bruno Fernando or Usman Garuba simply because they're younger. There's no reason to play a 31-year-old vet if you can get production even close from a guy that's young enough that could conceivably be a part of your future. So my guess is that Favors is a long shot to actually make the rotation, but he does have value. And it's worth pointing out that even if he doesn't play, it could be sort of similar to Daniel Tice a year ago, in which he still had neutral to slightly positive value at the trade deadline, simply because he's that type of trustworthy, defensive-oriented big that's been there, done that. He's a good teammate. Teams around the league, front offices know they can trust him, especially if they're in a pinch and have a loss due to injury. Favors is the kind of guy, in my opinion, that even if he doesn't play, then given his pedigree, the fact that he's been a productive player for nearly a decade now, most notably on those Utah teams a few years back, he's on an expiring contract. Worst case, you could trade him for, I would think, slightly positive value, maybe recoup another second-round pick at the deadline from a team needing a big, even if he doesn't play. But then you never know. If he shows you something in training camp or the Rockets have injuries of their own, then yeah, he's only 31 years old. He is capable of playing here. I just don't think he's your preferred option. Mo Harkless, Teo Maledon. Harkless, veteran wing, known most for his defense. My guess is that he's basically what Sterling Brown was before the trade, and that the Rockets see him as a useful player. There's no harm in rushing to a release because other than Willie Cauley-Stein, which that roster spot they're getting by waiving Ty Jerome, the Rockets don't have anything imminent that they need a roster spot for, so you might as well evaluate these guys in training camp. But just as Brown had long odds to make the roster as a defensive wing, Harkless probably does as well because, of course, you've got a pretty long wing rotation. Jalen Green, Eric Gordon, Garrison Matthews, Jayshawn Tate, Tari Eason, Josh Christopher. It's tough for another wing, especially a veteran that's 29 years old, and this is a rebuilding situation, to make an impact, but at least he'll get to look. Teo Maledon might be the most interesting, just 21 years old, 6'4" point guard, hasn't shot well at the NBA level, about 37%, 32% on threes his first 2 seasons, but he has a lot of length for a defender. He's out of France. Paulo, you're our Portugal correspondent, so maybe you know him on an international level a little bit. Is there anything you see from Maledon? I'm looking at his numbers: 7.1 points, 2.6 rebounds, 2.2 assists, and 17.8 minutes per game last year. I don't know how impactful he is on defense. I'm guessing he's at least useful based on the athleticism and the wingspan. It just looks to me on paper, and from what little I've seen of him with the Thunder, that he seems like the classic defensively versatile point guard who can do a lot of different things, but ultimately to play in the NBA, he needs that jump shot to come around at a much higher rate than it has his first 2 seasons. But again, he was a high second-round pick in the 2020 draft, number 34 overall, which is a good number for Houston, by the way. So maybe there is something there. He's going into his 3rd NBA season. To me, of the 3 that are staying for now, Maledon, I'm not going to say I expect him to stick. I think the odds-on scenario is that both Maledon and Harkless get waived in a couple of weeks with the impending sort of roster cuts. But I would say that Maledon at least has the most intrigue when you consider his age. Is that fair? What do you see in him?
Yeah, no, I agree completely that this is the only guy there that I would kind of take a second look at. But it's tough for the Rockets because he is, if I were to put an archetype on him, right, I would put him in that, type of Pat Beverly archetype. And this is a guy that's going to be more of a 3-and-D point guard, right? He has good defense. He was a good shooter before coming into the league. His first year, he did shoot 34% on 5 attempts a game. So he was decent there. It felt like there was potential as a 19-year-old coming into the league. He's 6'4", 6'8" wingspan, still very young, right? There's potential to be something there. But there's 2 unfortunate things. The first one is, well, the Rockets already have 2 backup point guards in Daishen Nix and Ty Washington. And so the immediate thought would be, well, he can go to the G League. But matter of fact is the Rockets also have a problem there because he is not on a 2-way contract. He's on a legit NBA deal, has a team option for next year. It's only the minimum salary because he was a 2nd-round pick. But he occupies a roster spot. And so for him to stay, you'd need to waive someone for him, whether that is not keeping Derrick Favors, whether that is, I don't know, Garrison Matthews, which seems like a complete long shot, whether that is trading KJ Martin into a team that doesn't give you a player back. Whatever that would be makes it really tough. And then the other thing is, even having him play for the Vipers in the G League is really complicated because he has more than $50K guaranteed for this season. And so if the Rockets waive him, they don't retain his G League rights because he has more than $50K guaranteed. Mm-hmm. And they can't downgrade his contract from an actual NBA deal to a 2-way because if you waive him, then you can't sign him back unless another team signs him first, which is what we saw with Gerald Green, if anybody remembers, back when he was traded to the Denver Nuggets. And so he is someone who's worth a look. Right, and his archetype as a 6'4" point guard with a long wingspan that is supposed to be able to shoot and defend, and he has some real playmaking chops, I would say as well. That's an intriguing prospect. And if the Rockets, and I would have loved to have him 2 years ago when we were running heavy minutes to David Nwaba and that season where we barely had any players. there I would have loved to have him, and I think he's definitely worth a shot for a rebuilding team. It's just unfortunate that this specific rebuilding team in the Rockets has 3 point guards in KPJ, Ty
Yeah.
and Knicks, and he could play some shooting guard, but even then, you've got Eric Gordon, Jalen Green, Josh Christopher, and it's always going to be tough to give him the minutes unless another trade checks out.
Yeah. And you were saying that you can't convert him to the two-way, or you can?
No, you can't. Sadly.
Okay, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, because they do have the open two-way, but yeah, that would be the obvious fit, but unfortunately not realistic in this case. Just from a basketball perspective, what does Maledon do better than Dacian or Tai? If you're trying to make the case for Maledon looking really good in training camp in the preseason, and we know that backup point guard spot behind Kevin Porter Jr. is basically up for grabs. Dacian Nix, Ty Washington, the rookie, now Teo Maledon. What is his advantage in that race? What are the things that he can do that maybe Nix or Ty can't, or are there any?
Probably the defense, right? I
Okay.
think he would probably be the best defender out of the three, but then I think he is more on the Ty mold as compared to Nix, as he is someone who can. I think Ty is the same thing: someone who can shoot, someone who can play off the ball, someone who can run second unit, probably, right? But he's the Ty mold while being worse than Ty across the board. I think he would be a worse bet than what Ty is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, it's if it were just Nix and Theo, then it would make sense to keep both of them because they're two different archetypes. Nix being more of that Kyle Lowry type, bully ball to the basket type of guy, get to the free throw line. But with Ty, once again, kind of the same archetype to some extent, it makes it really tough unless one of them gets traded. It's really tough to insert him. And now I would not doubt that the moment he is waived, if he is, that some team would pick him up.
Yeah. By the way, I'm guessing we're on the same page on Favors in that he's a good player, or at least a useful player at only 31 years old. But in this particular situation, I know that they want to back up big. They talked about that in the past, but with Usman Garuba coming off a strong Eurobasket run and Bruno Fernando apparently looking very good this first week in camp, I think if it's even close in this particular situation, then the Rockets are going to break the tie by going to Garuba or Fernando, the younger guy, right?
Yeah, it's so as far as Bruno goes, it's tough to see him actually having a solid spot in the rotation because once again, he's likely going to be on a two-way deal. And so, although I'm not sure if they changed the rule back since the COVID years, because I think they increased the limit of games during the COVID season. But before that, there was a limit of games for two-way deals. So I'm not sure how that works at this point. But I think Favors at this point is the best player out of the three. I don't think that's really up for debate. But the Rockets are a rebuilding team. And you're not looking for a guy that's going to give you functionality in the first unit that's really key, right? You're looking at a guy that's going to play 10 to 15 minutes in the second unit. And if that's the case, I would just go with Garuba and see what you have there because, as I said before on multiple occasions, next year they have a lot of cap space. And I would bet you that some of that cap space is going to be spent on a big man to play that second unit. And so this is really the year you have to really look at Garuba extensively against NBA competition. So take advantage of the blessing of having that time now and actually see what you have because Garuba was, at the end of the day, a first-round pick.
Good point. And by the way, I looked it up. The two-way players are limited to 50 games in the regular season. So it's back to the way it was pre-COVID. So yeah, if you end up using a two-way for Bruno, then yeah, you would have to be careful with the overall amount of games. And that does, at least in theory, hold his potential down. Now you could get into the argument that as you get closer to the trade deadline, you may open up a roster spot and then you could basically play him more than 50 because at some point you're going to have an open roster spot in the future. But of course, that's speculative, and who knows? You may end up taking on more players at the trade deadline, depending on the deals that are available. We don't know that there's going to be roster spots created. You might need to create more roster spots. So that sort of goes two-way. So yeah, the cleaner fit from a roster perspective is definitely Garuba. And that's sort of I feel like the undercurrent to a lot of this is that we talk about the upside that Maladon has, and I suppose Harkless as well as a trusty veteran wing on a team that definitely wants to get better defensively. But at the end of the day, the Rockets are still in the same spot that they were before, in that they have a lot of players, and cutting down to 15 and then the two-way slots is not going to be easy. I think Favors makes the roster simply because of his contract that's very useful, and you can slide him into where David Nwaba was before, in terms of that being basically your tradable salary slot, if you will. But beyond that, you're basically, you swapped out three guys that we know were not going to play in Brown, Burke, and Chris. The Rockets, it was reported from the start, had no plans for them. And so if they weren't traded, you're going to have to release those guys. Well, the same applies in all likelihood to who you're bringing in. And the only way that they can overcome that is if they can outplay someone that's currently on your projected roster. And that's pretty tough, just because the incentives are there to see what you've got. And guys like Usman Garuba, Garrison Matthews, that's the closest thing, I guess you could argue, to guys who might be not on the bubble, but guys are at least on the fringe enough to where, okay, if a guy clearly outplays them in training camp, you might think about putting them ahead of them in the pecking order. But that's just a really tall order, because if it's close, the Rockets are going to err on the side of, well, what makes the cleanest fit from a roster perspective. Anyway, we've talked 30 minutes now about this 8-player trade that basically results in the Rockets getting tradable salary and a future second-round pick. I think that's enough. Paulo, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, one last thing that I think it's also important to say is you have Nwaba as that kind of tradable salary, right? And the secondary option would be, if you need more than the 5 million Nwaba gives you, you could package him with Boban, which is not ideal, but in an extreme case, you could do it. One of the benefits of having Favors is when the season starts and teams are back down to the 15 roster spot limit, it would be really tough to make a trade where you're giving up more plays than you're bringing in because of that roster spot limit. We've seen last year DJ Augustine have to get waived because of that, when I would guess that he would have made the season if that trade didn't happen. We saw that with Armani Brooks as well. And so Derrick Favors being one big salary means that you're likely not going to have to make a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-2 deal that really facilitates making a deal in season, especially at the deadline. That's the last thing I would say.
And by the way, looking at the roster, I feel like it really points to the cleanest fit being Garuba as your backup 5, because if you wanted Bruno to actually be on your roster at some point, you would have to you would basically have 5 roster spots for what amounts to centers only, or close to centers only. And obviously Sengun as your starter, but then your veterans, Favors and Boban, Garuba, who no matter what, Garuba's clearly not going to be released. He was a first-round pick in 2021 for a reason. And then Bruno. So to actually give Bruno a standard deal and not be subject to those two-way game limitations, you would have 5 of your 15 roster spots going to players who are almost exclusively centers, which, as we've talked about, is pretty much where you have to optimize Usman Garuba at least at this point in his life cycle. By the way, updated measurements have him at 253 pounds, which shouldn't come as a surprise. Clearly, he put on some weight as last season progressed. So because of that, it's pretty difficult to imagine a 15-man roster with 5 centers only, especially 2 of them, Favors and Boban, being veterans that they're not wanting to play for obvious reasons anyway in a rebuild. So yeah, based on all of that, I think the clear preference in terms of what makes roster management the easiest would be for Garuba to show enough in preseason that you just make him your backup center and you go from there. And if he doesn't play well enough, then I guess you can give Favors or Boban a look. But by and large, Garuba is just the clean fit, right?
Especially when having 5 bigs, when you're trying to also find some minutes to play Jabari Smith Jr. and making the bridge to actually the training camp talk. When you're trying to make also minutes for Jabari Smith Jr. to play the 5, then having 5 centers is pretty much unheard of just by itself, let alone when you have another guy you're trying to give minutes at the 5 to see what you got there.
So yeah, let's talk trading camp, because it's been up and down the first 3 days in Lake Charles. They're headed back to Houston today. It's going to be an off day Friday, and then resume practice Saturday at Toyota Center, getting ready for the preseason opener on Sunday night against the Spurs. Those 3 days in Lake Charles from Tuesday through Thursday all sorts of mixed reports. Day one, there was the video the Rockets put out of Stephen Silas saying in the team huddle that it was the best day one that he's seen in all his NBA years, which is a pretty wild statement because he's coached.
That's a lot of years.
Yeah, like over 20 years as an assistant, including LeBron James in Cleveland, Steph Curry in Golden State, Luka in Dallas. And of course, when you think about it, it could make at least some sense from the standpoint of the Rockets had a lot of and have a lot of continuity. So they were more ready to go from the outset. We heard other reports about them playing together this summer, whereas a more veteran-laden team that has more offseason changes, and because they're veterans, they may not be together as much in the offseason. It does make sense that maybe this group is a bit more day one ready. But then the last couple of days, it's been a bit more mixed. Jonathan Fagan in the Chronicle on day two had a story that basically said that it was not as good as day one, and Silas was having to be more critical of those guys. And then day three, there was the reports that emerged on Twitter that the lineup with Jabari Smith, Eric Gordon, and Tari Eason, largely consisting of reserves, has significantly outplayed the unit that had a lot of the starters with Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr., and Alperen Sengun. We know this from some folks on Twitter who were lucky enough to be at McNeese State in the arena to watch this, and I do believe them because number one, they got some videos, clearly they were there, and then two, Jackson Gatlin posted a picture of the scoreboard which showed that the gray team had won 37-13, which happened to be what was reported by the guys that were there. Now, I did talk to some people, and I was told that the 37-13, you shouldn't consider that truly an apples to apples with an actual game, in that they may not have been counting score the exact same way that you would in a normal setting. So don't take that as gospel. But I do think it's fair to say the 37-13 does reflect that gray group outplayed the other one by a significant margin. And it sounds sort of odd at first glance because the three players that were reported to be part of that group were two rookies and Eric Gordon. But the more you think about it, or at least the more I think about it, it makes some sense, because when you think Jabari Smith, Tari Eason, Eric Gordon, I know two of them are rookies, but these are guys that defensively are grown men. They are physical, they talk, they communicate, they take that side of the ball very, very seriously. By the way, Jonathan Fagan had a clip on his timeline yesterday of Jabari absolutely locking up Jalen Green on a switch, which was really, really encouraging. And I just think early in training camp, defenses tend to have an advantage because even for teams that play a lot together in the offseason, these offseason runs, you know how it is, Paulo. These guys predominantly are playing not to get hurt. This is the first time that defenses are really going all out. You're seeing more physical play, more hard fouls because they're trying to get in and get ready for actual legitimate NBA basketball. And early in camp, if you put together Eric Gordon, who we know what he can do defensively, we know how strong he is, and then we know the length, the instincts of guys like Jabari Smith and Tari Eason, the more I think about it, the more it makes sense that that group in particular could have success, especially if maybe Jayshawn Tate was on it, but we haven't heard that yet. I just think that early in camp, the defenses have the advantage because offense, no matter what you do in the offseason, no matter how many runs you have, it's going to be an adjustment when you start going against defenders that are actually trying, that are actually being physical. And that group with Jabari, Tari, and Eric Gordon just has more tools. So early in camp, the physicality of that trio, I hope that in a couple of weeks, you see the KPJ, Jalen, Sengun group getting more in sync offensively and having some counters to the defense that's being thrown out. But the more I think about it, at least initially, it's not that shocking that the defense-led group is a little bit ahead of the offense. Where are you at on that?
Yeah. So you don't want to, make draw huge conclusions out of what's, training camp. But as a fan, it's just exciting to imagine a iron sharpens iron type of situation where you had Jalen Green last season, but the team was just awful defensively. And now you have these two guys, in Tari Eason and Jabari Smith, who are coming in and they're not letting him score. And it's one of those things where if within your own team in practice you have these tremendous defenders and you're trying to score on them, you're going to get better yourself at your offense. And at the other end of the spectrum, those guys are going to demand more out of you defensively. And I think that's something really important. And it kind of reflects what the NBA is. A lot of the rebuilding teams, the ones that have success versus the ones that don't, a lot of the times the difference is defense. Because we've seen the Timberwolves be one of the most talented teams in the league. How many top 10 picks did they have on their roster at some point before this year? And still, because of defense in specific, they could not get over the hump, and they only made the playoffs when they had Jimmy Butler, which, I mean, if you didn't, it would be a concern. But there were a lot of years there where they weren't making it because the defense wasn't there. The Cleveland Cavaliers, the same thing. All of a sudden, they bring in Evan Mobley and Jared Allen, and they're a playoff team. The Memphis Grizzlies is a story of success because they play good defense. They have Jaren Jackson Jr., and he brings that defensive side of the ball along with just the team culture that they have. And on the other hand, the Kings, why are they consistently bad? Because they're consistently a team that has young players that are good on offense, like Sabonis, like De'Aaron Fox. But then on a defensive end, you're lacking a little bit, and you were for a long time. And so it's interesting that these pickup games also reflect that to some extent. The team that has the good defense, even if they're young, is going to outperform the team that's just explosive offensively, because they're explosive offensively, but they're still really young. And a lot of winning games on offense comes from, in those really important moments, knowing what to do, and that comes with experience. And so I'm really excited. And if you kept up with my draft coverage last year, you know that I was a big Paulo Banchero guy. And I've had to look back on it and kind of reflect on how I viewed things back then. And I don't think I've got the scouting report wrong on either player. Jabari is exactly what I expected him to be. What I needed to readjust was the importance I placed on different aspects of the game. I thought you needed to get as many star ball handler creators as you could, and then you'd bring the defense around them. But I'm realizing now that it's also probably going to be really important to have a guy that hangs his head on defense that is a huge part of the team, because you can get those guys later in the rounds, but they're not going to be as good, and they're not going to be as vocal and as prioritized in the team, even from a leadership standpoint, as selecting a guy at number 3 that's going to be defensive focused, or at least to begin his career. And so I loved seeing from Jabari the leadership. I loved seeing him give his all, even in practice. I loved seeing him talk to the media. I think he was really charismatic. And I really, really like envisioning him in some sort of, from a personality management standpoint, some sort of Draymond role where this is the defensive leader of this team, and he's going to demand that you play better, and that you try on the defensive end. And that's one of the corners that usually rebuilding teams have to turn. And I'm really happy that we've got that in Jabari. And then usually with defensive players, there's 3 things. You need to have the tools, you need to have the mentality, and you need to be good enough on offense to stay on the floor. Because we've seen examples of tools, no mentality, and the tools offensively, and that sometimes doesn't pan out. And then you've got examples of the tools and the mentality, but then offensively you can't make it work, as you can see by just players that are really good defensively but can't shoot on the offensive end, right? And then you've got players that have the mentality and are passable on the offensive end, but don't have the tools. And that's when you see the PJ Tuckers of the world, where, yes, PJ can spot up and shoot threes. He's passable offensively, great. Yes, he's got that motor. He can play defensively. But imagine how much better PJ Tucker would be if he had the tools that Jabari Smith has, for example. And that's when you start looking at these all-time greats. And I don't want to put that tag on Jabari, far from it. But that's when you're looking at these, best defender in the league types, or defensively focused players that are top 20 players in the league. And I think Jabari has all 3 of those. He's a lethal shooter. If nothing else, he's at the very least a lethal shooter. He is 6'10" with a 7-foot, 6'10" or 6'11", we don't know, with a 7-foot wingspan. He's extremely mobile. You can see in that clip with Jalen Green, and there's the famous picture from earlier in the offseason where it's just Jabari standing with his arms up in that defensive stance. Like, he's taking up so much space. So he has the tools. And I think he clearly has the defensive mentality, and he's shown that pretty much every time we've had a chance to look at him play. In training camp, in summer league, he hung his head on defense because the shot was not falling. And so he seems to have the combination of the three. And that's really, really rare.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And people rave, by the way, sorry to cut you off, but
yeah.
people with the Rockets rave about him behind the scenes, just the intangibles, the culture aspect. That's just so rare, especially in a young player. And I think it offsets Jalen really well, who's, again, he's just 20 years old, so he may grow into some of these traits, but he's a little bit quiet, especially on the court now. So to have a guy who really embraces some of the more intangible factors, vocal leadership, it's a good contrast. And even after a few days, I can tell you for a fact, people that are in Lake Charles or were in Lake Charles that are behind the scenes, that are watching what's going on, they are raving about not just Jabari Smith, the player, but Jabari Smith, the person, and how important that is to what the Rockets are trying to build.
Yeah, and the other thing I would bring up that is really important with young teams and defense is communication. And it seems that Jabari is very much a communicator on defense. And so it's just this perfect mixture of characteristics: the size, the length, the speed, the willingness to do it, the hanging your hat on it, the fact that you're not someone who can stay on the floor offensively, far from it. And now you're also a good communicator and you're also a leader, right? There's potential for something really special there, because you've now, in your first 2 years of a rebuild, you've got a guy that's very clearly going to be your defensive leader, right? With all of the tools and all of the mentality and all of the hard work. And then offensively, you have Jalen, who is the exact same thing, but offensively, a guy with all the tools, the speed, the length, the bounce, the shiftiness, the ability to shoot. There's basically no flaw to Jalen's offensive game that seems unfixable. He needs to bulk up a little bit, but that's part of the process. And so you've got a key offensive piece and a key defensive piece 2 years into the rebuild. And for a team that has as little time to rebuild as the Rockets do, I think they really hit the jackpot there, and it's really exciting. And we're recording this on a Friday. We play Sunday. I wish I could just go to sleep right now and wake up Sunday.
Yeah, I get it. And we'll close out by talking about Sunday, or actually we'll get to that in a few minutes. I got one more question about training camp for you. But to close the loop on Jabari, I think the other thing that's really encouraging is the potential combination with Jae'Sean Tate, because when we talk about sort of the importance of communication, I think if you're just one guy out of five bringing those traits, then it's easy for that to sort of get lost in the shuffle. And I think that's what happened at times the last 2 years with Tate. But if we're talking about two guys that are potentially in your starting five, but worst case in your top six in terms of rotation minutes, we're talking about two guys in Jabari and Jae'Sean that bring that type of vocal communication. That makes it all the easier for them not to be drowned out. Because if it's just one guy, it's sort of easy for other guys to eventually just revert to their old patterns. But if you have two guys in there that are both talking and communicating at all times the way Jae'Sean does, and it sure as hell looks like Jabari is ready to, even at 19 years old, then that's a much bigger proportion of your rotation to where it makes it a lot harder for those other guys not to hold their weight, for them not to make the effort. And so I think having not one, but two culture guys, it puts that balance much closer to where you need it to be to get the culture overall where it needs to be for guys to really buy in on that side. And that goes back to what you were saying. Not a lot of young teams have that, because so many young prospects tend to be tilted towards offense, and the Rockets have a pretty good balance going on with the Jabari Smith pick, and that's why I'm really bullish on it as well. As far as the other side of the ball and what they're trying to do on offense, Stephen Silas had some interesting comments. I forget if it was Wednesday or Thursday, but basically talking about tweaking the scheme to incorporate Alperen Sengun. And we heard during the offseason that the playbook was going to be expanded relative to last year, that a year ago it was intentionally vanilla because so many of the guards in particular were brand new either to the NBA or to their role, in the case of Kevin Porter Jr. as a point guard for the first time. The others, Jalen Green, Josh Christopher, playing NBA basketball for the first time in their lives. And so this year, we knew the playbook was going to be more expansive, showing more layers. That's been a popular discussion point for months now on Rockets Twitter. It's just up to the team to show those and execute those. And for Silas to use training camp in the preseason to put them in position to do that. This week, we heard some particulars about not just new layers, but I guess adapting more to personnel, because now that Christian Wood is no longer the starting center and Alperen Sengun is, it's a different skill set. Christian Wood, much more of a traditional pick and roll, pick and pop big. When I say traditional, I mean in the modern NBA, really your spacing five, whereas Sengun is something more of a hub. To truly utilize him, you've got to give him the ball at times on the block, at times in the mid-range, try to play to his skills as a passer. And so Stephen Silas talked about installing an offensive system that isn't just 5 out, which is what we know he loves to run going back to his time in Dallas, but 4 out, 1 in, Sengun, of course, being the 1 in. And that system needs more to work with the slightly reduced spacing, then you need more off-ball movement. And that is going to be a change for guys like Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr. I actually talked to Jae'Sean Tate earlier in the week, and he pointed out that he's really bullish on his fit with Sengun because he is a willing off-ball cutter and a good one. But the other guys in that lineup, especially the backcourt, the high usage guys, KPJ and Jalen, they weren't used to having to do a lot of off-ball movement a year ago. Now, to fully optimize it with Sengun, they're going to have to. And Silas actually spelled that out after talking about using 4 out, 1 in. He mentioned that these guys have got to move without the ball, that it can't be as sticky as it was a year ago. And I don't know how much they're going to be humming game 1 of the preseason against San Antonio, but clearly I think it's a point of emphasis. We've talked about this a little bit before, but just functionally, how different is an offense with Alperen Sengun going to look, or how different should it look relative to what they were doing with Christian Wood a year ago?
I think we'll still see pick and roll. I think the fact that Sengun sets better screens will help with that. Mm-hmm. But I'm a big fan of not just running 5 out, because running 5 out implies that you have a guy that can consistently create his own advantages basically every time down the floor, 1 or 2 guys. That's why it works with James Harden. That's why it works. I think it will lead to more scripted offense, and I like that. I like that Silas will actually be telling people what to do, because I think that's key for a team this young. Because we saw last year them try to run a set, it not getting an advantage, or not reading the advantage in time, resetting, trying to run the set again if there's time. If there isn't time, just devolve into an ISO. We saw that so much last year, and hopefully this year it will be different. I think we will probably see Sengun as a post up a lot. We saw Jalen Green move off the ball last year. We didn't see so much of Kevin Porter Jr. It was mostly he would run the set and then he'd relocate to whatever the point guard needed to relocate to when he gave the ball away. But it's going to be really interesting, because a team this athletic, cutting should be a major threat, because they're quick, they're athletic, they're going to get through him really quickly, and the faster you are at cutting, the more on their toes the defense needs to be to keep up with that. And so I think it will be a lot better than it was last season, and I think we'll get a lot of highlights of Sengun just making some crazy passes because someone forgot Jalen Green was moving all the time. And that's one of the advantages of why I give Silas some credit for Jalen Green being such a good off-ball player. It is someone as quick as he is. If he is moving off the ball a lot, you're going to lose him a lot, because it's really tiring for the defense to be keeping track with the guy that's moving on. We see that with Steph Curry all the time. That's why he gets loose, because even the best defensive players at some point will lose you, because there's just so many challenges, one after the other, that you're going to make a mistake. And I think Sengun is the perfect guy to exploit those mistakes. We'll see how it works with KPJ. I'll see, it's not going to be as easy as just running pick and roll and kicking out after, you either hit the man rolling or you hit the open guy in the corner that the help's coming off of. It's not going to be as easy for KPJ. But then at the same time, he's not going to be requested. I don't think he's going to be requested to ball handle as much as he did last season, where he was basically the Luka role. So it'll be really interesting. And I wanted to bring up just one more point about the Jabari stuff that you said earlier, which is, if you talked about Jabari and Tate. Yes, I agree. I'd also like to include Tyrese in there because what we saw in Summer League was really encouraging in the sense that you have Jabari demanding more out of everybody else. But then you need someone to go demand more out of Jabari when Jabari is not like when the shots isn't falling, or he's still a young guy. There's going to be moments where he's not, peak confidence, and he's going to be down sometimes. And I think it's important that he's got a guy in Tyrese and that's going to go to him and like talk to him and pump him up. And we saw that there was a viral GIF back in Summer League. I don't know if you remember, of Tyrese and just going to him and like demanding more out of him. And I think it's important that you might have the leader, but you have someone who's going to check the leader as well.
For sure. And by the way, we should point out to our listeners, definitely not overlooking Eric Gordon, who's a very capable defender in his own right. It's just a couple of things. Number one, he does take back-to-back games off, so he don't want to call him a part-time player, but he's not out there all the time anyway. And then secondly, we don't know exactly when, but the odds are Eric Gordon is not going to be on the team. I guess there's a small chance that he is when the Rockets are next trying to contend in a couple of years. So be it he leaves via trade, free agency, whatever it may be, we're focusing a little bit more on the young guys because these are the ones that are more a part of the culture moving forward. Eric Gordon's definitely a part of the culture right now. It's just, is he really a long-term piece? You can't rule it out, but as a guy who turns 34 years old later this year, it's less important to talk about that as it is relative to guys like Jabari, Tari, and Jayshawn Tate, where those guys are much more a part of the culture you're trying to build, not just now, but when this team wants to be a contender a few years down the line. Paulo, The last topic I want to go into, Game 1, Sunday night, Rocket Spurs. I've talked the last few weeks about being bullish on the Rockets hitting the over on some of their projected win totals. In Vegas, it's anywhere between 23.5 and 25.5 wins. One of the reasons for that is the fact that they have a lot more continuity than the other bad teams around the league. And also, there's much more of a West tilt to the tanking teams now. The last couple of years, one of the reasons the Rockets have been so bad is that most of the other tanking teams are in the East, who you only play 2 times a year, whereas now you see teams in the West, San Antonio and the Jazz, taking a clear step back. The Thunder, they never left the tanking tier, but they're even more in it now that Chet's not going to play. We don't know when Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is going to be available. So you have more teams at the bottom of the West that are in a really bad spot than they were the last couple of years, and that's teams that the Rockets play usually 4 times a year. A couple of teams you do play only 3, but for the most part, teams in the West, you play 4 times. So based on all of that, the continuity the Rockets have, even though they're still young, they're still not that good, I do think there's a chance that this team sneaks into the upper 20s and wins. And not going to put too much pressure on a preseason game because it is the preseason, but I do want to note going into Game 1 that you're going up against a team in San Antonio that's one of those really bad teams, or supposed to be. They don't have continuity. They're clearly in the Wemby Scoot Henderson race. They're clearly not putting a priority on this season. They don't have much continuity the way the Rockets do. So while it's the first week of the preseason, at the same time that applies to the Spurs as well. This is a game in which I'm not going to say the Rockets should win by X amount of points, because clearly preseason is not about wins and losses. It's about experiments. It's about trying things. I do think, though, it's a game in which the Rockets should at least look competent. They should look comfortable, because this is one of the worst teams in the NBA. And while I'm not going to put a number on, they should win by X points. I suppose my outlook going in terms of things I want to see, certainly the X's and O's. You want to see how they use Sengun relative to Christian Wood, like we were just talking about. You want to see the defensive culture and what things look like with Jabari, Tari, Jayshawn Tate, Eric Gordon if he plays. Do they start Eric Gordon or do they start Jayshawn Tate? What does that rotation look like? You want to see those things. But above all else, they've talked a big game all offseason about being together, the advantages of continuity. I've personally talked a big game the last few days about this being a setup for them to sneakily win a few more games than people might think, just based on the composition of the West. And so leading off against one of those teams that's supposed to be really bad, they should at least look comfortable. They should at least look confident going in that this is a team that they should be able to go out, even as young as they are, and execute their sets and be a functional NBA team on both ends of the court. So above any particular, I just want to see them go out and basically act like that they are at least on the Spurs level, if not better. What are you looking for in this matchup besides the obvious just return of basketball? What do you want to see on the court when the Rockets and Spurs play Sunday night?
Yeah, I don't have really high expectations. I am someone who's completely okay with tanking another season, and obviously not losing on purpose or sitting young guys, but
Yeah.
the organic tanking that people talk about, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like I'm happy to say this, but I think they should comfortably beat the Spurs. Mostly
Okay.
because this is a team that has, I think, 3 rookies in Malachi Branham. Joshua Primo barely played. Jeremy Sohan, and there's one, I think, and Blake Wesley. And so they're likely going to play those guys. However, this is still a pop team, right? And so they're going to be well coached. So it's not, I think they're going to punch above their weight when it comes to the talent that they have versus how they're going to play. But at the same time, like, they don't have a true point guard, for example. They've got a bunch of shooting guards, and that's it. And we've seen over the last season how tough it is, especially for a young team, to play without a true point guard. They traded away DeJounte Murray. He's not on the team anymore. That rivalry match with KPJ is not there anymore. Rockets versus Spurs over the last few years has produced some really interesting, some really exciting games. We got the Jalen Green dunk over Jakob Poeltl there. We've got the Sengun dunk over Jakob Poeltl as well. We've got I think there's the I think Jay Shante had a really good game against them back the first year he was here. The first time we saw Christian Wood, I think, was also against the Spurs, and he had that monster game where we were like, oh, okay, this guy's for real. And then, well, unfortunately, we know what happened after that. But I think it's going to be a really exciting game. I'm really excited to see how the Spurs rookies perform as well. And then besides that, from the Rockets' perspective specifically, I want to see if Jalen's shooting to end last season was real. I want to see him being used on the ball a little bit more. I'm paying attention to Kevin Porter Jr.'s finishing because he was really good the first half year he was here. That looked like a strength of his, and the shot was a weakness. And then year 2, the shot looked like a strength, and the finishing looked like the weakness. So I'm looking for the finishing with KPJ. With Jabari, I want to see that shot because it was scary to some extent to see him struggle in summer league. And I think the pace of the game was what was frustrating to him, and he was not tuning in the rhythm that he usually does. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how his shot looks as he sped it up to any extent. We know his shot looks beautiful, but it looked flat in summer league. So I want to see how that looks. We saw some practice footage earlier this week. It looked great. So hopefully it looks great as well, because that's going to be one of the most exciting things, one of the most exciting plays you picture this for the season is, you got Sengun in the post kicking it out to Jabari. It's like finally having a guy that you expect to knock down the shot, because we have a lot of guys that we were comfortable taking the shot, but none that besides Gary Borden and Eric Gordon, of the young guys, you've got none that you're like, he's getting the ball, he gets the shot up, and you're expecting it to go in. Right, all of the guys started off cold, and so that plays a part into it as well. And besides that, just how's Jason Tate shooting? Are the offseason rumors real? Is he actually a 3-and-D wing now? So that's interesting as well. And lastly, how do they structure the bench unit is one of the big things. I think Knicks is going to be the one that's playing. Are they going to stagger one of the big 3 or big 4 to play them in the second unit, that are going to play them together basically exactly as units? Or who's going to be the main ball handler in the second unit? We know there's Deshaun Nix there, but we know there's also Josh Christopher there, who is, I guess, has seniority over him to some extent. So we saw what that looked like in summer league. I'm not quite looking forward to Josh Christopher, the lead ball handler, quite yet. I think he's more of the true shooting guard rather than a combo guard. So how that dynamic and how the ball handling works in the second unit is also really interesting, and we'll see what they decide to do. Also, I know it's typical in preseason games that towards the end of the game you play the bench guys. Man, I wish we just played. I wish we just played. The main guy. I'm so excited. I wish we just played the main guys for the entire 48 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that's young enough that, the main guys need the preseason reps too.
Exactly.
Yeah. And by the way, before we sign off, I know I cut you off when we were talking about briefly Eric Gordon and the defensive culture with Jabari, Tari, Jay Tate. So close the loop on that. What were you trying to add in there?
I don't think I remember.
Okay. Sorry, man. Well, I cut you off, so I'm sure you had a
okay.
nice thought, but we'll save it for next time. Anyway, folks, this is where we will wrap it today. For Paulo, I'm Ben. If you want to follow Paulo, which I strongly encourage you to do so, you can go to Paulo Alves NBA on Twitter, and you can also subscribe there to his Nameless Notes newsletter, which is where he's got long-form thoughts on various topics related to the Houston Rockets. As for me, Ben DuBose, you can follow me at Ben DuBose, pretty simple, just my name, on Twitter, and then my writing is in Rockets Wire, the USA Today blog covering the Houston Rockets, rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets needs. Also, before we sign off, I want to throw out a shout out to our sponsors, Clutch City Lager of Karbach Brewing. You should follow them at Karbach Brewing on Twitter. And of course, we want to acknowledge Sports Talk 790, the official flagship radio station of the Rockets, for their support as well. Follow them at Sports Talk 790, and you can check out their shows at sports790.com. With the plugs out of the way, we will wrap this. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.